My name is Hilary Miller. I am completing my master's degree at Columbia University in New York. But I have to say, I'd be remiss if I failed to mention that I am a proud undergraduate of the University of Wisconsin-Madison, which Professor Goldberg, he insists that I call him Chad, but just a few years ago I was an undergraduate at the University of Wisconsin and a proud student of the Center for Jewish Studies. So I'm glad that this is probably the first time in UCL lecture hall history that there are 4 Badgers in the room, including my parents, myself, and Chad. So go Badgers. I am delighted to be here to present my research that looks at the effects of anti-Semitism envoys on the local, national, regional, and international levels of government on the global effort to monitor and combat contemporary anti-Semitism. Broadly, anti-Semitism envoys are government-appointed individuals with an independent mandate to monitor and combat anti-Semitism. I'll explain more in detail what anti-Semitism envoys are, what the constitution of these mandates look like, after first noting a bit about this research. So this research is very fresh. I just did this over the summer to complete my master's thesis at Columbia for the Institute for the Study of Human Rights. And as I said, this was done over the summer. I just clicked submit a few days ago, so I very much apologize if I'm very thorny with the details. I'm going to do my best to give you the macro point of view. And the particular examples that I do give, I decided to do it UK specific. I heard Lord John Mann is in the room or in the vicinity, so I hope to do his mandate justice in sharing a bit of examples of the work that he's doing. So I want to first pose a very broad question that animated this research broadly. What are the effects of the anti-Semitism envoy on the global effort to monitor and combat anti-Semitism? So today, I ask you as an audience to consider these questions that I want to explore specifically. What are anti-Semitism envoys? I'm going to explain this. And in what context did they emerge, and in what context are new mandates being created today? What are anti-Semitism envoys doing? Who are these people? Where are they working? And what do they contribute exactly to this global combat anti-Semitism movement? And what is it about this particular tool, this particular instrument, that is significant and that is unique in the global effort to combat anti-Semitism? So after answering these questions, I want to conclude with a few key takeaways from this research and give you my thoughts on why this is significant. So broad question, what are anti-Semitism envoys? In what context did they emerge? Anti-Semitism envoys are also referred to as commissioners, personal representatives, coordinators, or focal points. They are individuals appointed by a governing body with a mandate to address the particular issue of anti-Semitism. The envoy is unique in so much that it constitutes a standalone mandate on Jew hate, on anti-Semitism. But the type of position is anything but inventive. The template comes from similar models like special representatives or coordinators deployed by states or regional bodies to mediate conflicts or address thematic issues of global concern. An apt analog, which I use as the premier analog in my research, is the UN Special Rapporteur, which is an independent expert appointed by the world body to report on a country-specific issue or a thematic human rights issue. Again, these individuals are focused on a single topic. These actors are high-value instruments in foreign policy and international relations with a remarkable degree of operational flexibility. And with this flexibility, they can maneuver around the typical constraints of group-based mechanisms and therefore devote significant attention, time, and resources to any one problem. And these unique attributes of the envoy position is why it appeals to an executive or a legislative body wishing to take meaningful action on a particular issue. So the innovation of the anti-Semitism envoy really was a direct response to Durban after 2001. I could go into the whole history of that. I'm going to restrain myself from it, even though I find it fascinating on a historical and intellectual level. But in the last 2 decades since Durban, there have been a cascade of envoy appointments on the local, national, regional, and international levels of government. beginning with the US envoy in 2004, followed by the OSCE in 2009, then the European Union and North Macedonia in 2015, and then after 2015 is when we see multiple envoy appointments on the national level, also Canada, also the OAS, and most recently Israel in 2022. This proliferation of envoys occurring at all levels of government around the world in the short span of 20 years and precipitating really in the last decade is remarkable. It's a phenomenon in and of itself. It testifies to the growing prominence of the envoy within this arsenal of combat anti-Semitism tools and mechanism. That's what I call it, and I'll get into that more specifically, what this universe of combat anti-Semitism is in my research. But it's also a trend, these envoy appointments, it's a trend that by no accident coincides with another, which is that rates of anti-Semitism are increasing, reaching near historic levels around the world. In 2022, Jews are being attacked on street corners, Jews are being accosted in subways, Jews are being pilloried on Twitter, Jews are being made pariahs on college campuses and held hostage in the sanctuary of a synagogue. That the anti-Semitism envoy has been so widely accepted by European states reflects the scale and severity of the problem in the region too. So it is in this context that envoys are becoming increasingly relevant, popular, and admired subjects in this discursive realm of combat anti-Semitism strategy and policy design, so much so that they have already been lauded as, quote, this was a quote from the World Jewish Congress president from around 2 years ago, quote, perhaps the most important people helping the Jewish people fight anti-Semitism. So think about that. Perhaps the most important people helping the Jewish people fight anti-Semitism. When I read that, I found that so convenient. Like, oh, so we don't need to test that then. We already, we found the solution to an age-old hatred. No, absolutely not. That was the crux of my research, which was, with only such a basic understanding of envoys as a novel tool to fight this 21st century manifestations of an age-old hatred. I didn't want that presumption that these tools, that these individuals in this tool, was the concrete solution to this global issue. So, such high praise for a relatively new position that has emerged in a new response to anti-Semitism should be subject to scrutiny before making any sweeping declaration about its import or value. So this research, I hope, is at least a starting point in closing the knowledge gap on what these actors do and what they're doing and what their potential is. How I came to my conclusions, a bit on the methodology. The scope of this research is limited to the effects of, like I said, local, national, regional, international envoys to identify patterns and common practices among these mandate holders. And only after identifying common patterns among them could I really do the analytical work to determine what makes this tool significant in this, what I call the universe of combat anti-Semitism tools and mechanisms that within the constitution of this universe being action plans, strategies, the IRA definition, parliamentary declarations and resolutions, instructional guides and manuals, working groups, legal frameworks, and sophisticated incident reporting and data collection hubs. I relied primarily on human subjects research. Basically, I spent all summer interviewing professionals from NGOs. Holly Huffnagel was one of them. Thank you very much, Holly, for contributing to this research. And as well as envoys themselves. I secured 6 interviews with current anti-Semitism envoys, including the EU envoy, the OSCE envoy, the German envoy, the UK envoy, the Baden-Württemberg envoy in Germany on the local state level, as well as 2 former US envoys. I should note, my study was limited to envoys only with internal-facing mandates. So what does that mean? Envoys that address anti-Semitism affecting the constituents within the remit of their appointed government body. So of course I'm on the America panel. You would think I would evaluate Deb Lipstadt, the US Special Envoy for Combating Anti-Semitism. Huge fan of the US Special Envoy for Combating Anti-Semitism. However, Holly will be the first one to tell you that the U.S. Special Envoy is housed in the State Department with an external-facing mandate. The U.S. Special Envoy does not address anti-Semitism at home in the United States, so I did not subject Professor Lipstadt or preceding or envoys before her to my study, although inadvertently the U.S. envoy is included in my research in some areas because the issue of anti-Semitism, as you're all well aware, is universal, and you can't take the U.S. Special Envoy out of this conversation. What are the effects of envoys? This is what I was looking at all summer. I identified 6 categories of action, gleaned from identifying common patterns and practices among envoys. Envoys' work is essentially dynamic and cross-cutting. And because anti-Semitism is essentially universal, these categories should not be interpreted, understood, received as totally atomized groupings, but instead as interconnected, transversal realms that capture broadly how envoys are advancing efforts to combat anti-Semitism around the world. Like I said, if I could bore you for a very long time with specific examples of how within each category envoys are demonstrating each of the 6 things that I'll share with you. But I won't. I can share the paper with you after the fact if you would like to bore yourself on your own time. But here's what I identified broadly as the 6 categories, what envoys are doing. Number 1, envoys are serving as liaisons between government and the Jewish community. Number 2, envoys are elevating anti-Semitism on the government agenda in ways that amount to material change in domestic policy, procedure, and specifically in the German case, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention it, German law. The German envoy Felix Klein has amended the Judiciary Act, see now I'm getting into the details, in order to make it mandatory that all German law students study Nazi weaponization of the law and the judicial system during the Nazi era as part of their mandatory studies. So he changed the law in order to make that mandatory. Number 3, envoys are advancing combat anti-Semitism instruments as essential leaders in their development, in their adoption, and their implementation. I will only use an example under this one to talk about Lord John Mann's efforts because it's absolutely remarkable and for this audience is particularly relevant. So the UK envoy, Lord John Mann, has made the advancement of the IRA definition a focus of his mandate. He is leading a tremendous campaign to make the definition a mainstay of every institution in all realms of this country, in government, in civil society, in education, sport, and culture. Danny Stone, perhaps some of you know him, of the Anti-Semitism Policy Trust, who gave me time for this research, which I'm incredibly grateful for, said, quote, what John has achieved just in terms of pushing IRA across the country is absolutely remarkable. The data proves the point. As of November 2020-21, more than 200 universities, colleges, and higher institutions of higher education across the United Kingdom have adopted the IRA definition. So has every English city and every political party represented at Westminster. All but 1 member of parliament have endorsed the IRA definition. And in 2020, the English Premier League, the world's most popular sports league, comprised of 20 football clubs, adopted the working definition. And it's, it bears mentioning too that the UK envoy's success here with IRA has transcended borders, and other countries are following suit and trying to do the same. As Felix Klein told me in our interview, the German envoy, that he is adopting kind of Lord Mann's campaign strategy and for football clubs in Germany. And then the Bulgarian envoy also pledged as much in the Malmo Forum pledges about spreading the definition of IRA in sport in that country. So that's number 3, advancing combat anti-Semitism tools, specifically the IRA definition. Number 4, envoys are exposing the problem of contemporary anti-Semitism through varied means of communication by engaging meaningfully with news media, taking interviews and press releases from their own offices, on social media, on Twitter. Lord John Mann has a thick Twitter following. You should follow him if you don't. It's very entertaining. And then also by supporting sophisticated incident reporting and data collection tools. Envoys understand fundamentally that in order to combat anti-Semitism, you need the data to prove the point. And so they're investing in those institutions on the federal level. I look specifically in the German case with RIAS in the German federal funding that is going towards that data reporting mechanism. Number 5, envoys are recalibrating the combat anti-Semitism approach by promoting Jewish life. This is remarkable. It's not only reflected in their official titles, so the European Commission Coordinator's title is the European Commission Coordinator on Combating Anti-Semitism and Fostering Jewish Life. The Felix Klein, the German envoy, his official title is the Federal Government Commissioner for Jewish Life in Germany and the Fight Against Anti-Semitism. So it's reflected in the moniker of these positions, but is also as much as it is in the rhetoric and in the action of envoys. The Dutch envoy, who was appointed in 2021, said, quote, "It is very important to show that Jews have always been a part of the Netherlands and that the Jewish community belongs to this country. That is the essence of the fight against anti-Semitism. My mission is to make sure that it is clear to everyone that it is normal to be Jewish, that it is normal to express it, and that it is normal, and that Jews are normal and equal part of Dutch society." So that quote captures broadly the animating ethos of a lot of these envoys, that it's not just enough to combat anti-Semitism, it must be enough to embrace Jews as part of a local national entity. Number 6, okay, so this really was what I found most fascinating about the effects. Number 6, best for last. Anti-Semitism envoys are globalizing efforts to combat anti-Semitism in ways that stand out in what is already a global movement forged by leaders in government and civil society before the advent of the envoy. They are operating in different contexts on varying levels of government, and in that way, they constitute this unique international cohort of common actors, their own epistemic community, in spite of their internal facing mandates and the variability between contexts. So it is this epistemic community that has developed from envoys' cross-pollination of ideas and multi-level exchanges and collaboration. The community has been sustained by regular engagement at relevant international gatherings, and it is typified by the United Nations focal point on anti-Semitism, the UN envoy. This idea of the envoys as globalizing efforts to combat anti-Semitism was captured this summer. In June 2022, I had the honor of being able to attend a formal briefing on efforts to combat anti-Semitism at the UN headquarters in New York. Jewish groups were in the room, key stakeholders were in the room, UN member states were in the room, and of course, anti-Semitism envoys were in the room, chief among them, the OSCE envoy, the EU envoy, the OAS envoy, and the US envoy were in the room, delivering key interventions and offering insights on how to bolster the UN response to Jew hate. I should say that they were in town in New York for AJC's Global Forum, and you look at various news articles that came out, you look at Twitter, kind of how these envoys were interacted, they are being treated and recognized as their own advocacy group. Together, they met with Linda Thomas Greenfield, the US ambassador to the United Nations, and are discussing ways that they can exchange best practices and ways to combat anti-Semitism within their own context, but together as an international community. So now that I've outlined for you what envoys are doing, what makes them significant? Why does this particular tool stand out? I identify 5 key ways. First and foremost, the envoy is an uncompromised voice, theoretically, but I've proven that it's beyond just theoretical in my research, but theoretically, because these individuals have independent government mandates, they're not compromised they're exempt from the proclivities and certain political pressures that typically constrain or limit other leaders in government. Dr. Felix Klein, the German envoy, captures as much in this quote when he was asked in an interview which type of anti-Semitism today presented the greatest danger. He says, quote, "I fight every form of anti-Semitism. There is no lighter or less dangerous anti-Semitism. We have to fight it everywhere. There's a red line, and we have to fight it in every form, whether it's BDS or right-wing or anti-Zionist. If you make a prioritization, then you immediately get into a discussion of one group played out against the other. That is a useless discussion, and I'd like to avoid that." The second way that envoys are significant, the envoy is a mobilizer of other combat anti-Semitism instruments. Mike Wine, who I presume some of you may know in this room, his title and credentials are far too long for me to explain, but I'll say simply that he's a UK security expert who used to head the Community Security Trust here in the UK. He described the envoy to me, and this is the title of my paper, as the catalysts for change, as the tool with the greatest capacity to leverage, develop, or set in motion all of the other combat anti-Semitism tools. So basically what he's getting at is that envoys have a particular kinetic energy. They're able to advance the IRA definition, they're able to convene working groups, they're able to do meaningful action as independent actors, and that is indeed significant. Number 3, the envoy serves as a barometer of combat anti-Semitism policy progression. So essentially what I identified in my research is that envoys can, not in all situations, but most, serve as a sort of gauge, a diagnostic tool for where a government is at on the spectrum of an institutionalized policy scheme around combating anti-Semitism. So in Europe, the envoy is located somewhere on the latter part of a spectrum of a government's combat anti-Semitism policy plan. If we look specifically at the UK, we see that in 2004, the UK government established an all-party parliamentary group against anti-Semitism. Then in 2016, the UK adopted the IRA definition. Then in 2019, we see the appointment of Lord John Mann. So again, envoys are later on in the spectrum. I talk about how envoys are emblematic of a human rights-based approach to combating anti-Semitism, where the onus is on government to promote and protect and respect the welfare of Jews within their own constituency. Envoys as a norm entrepreneur in foreign policy, essentially where I get at with this, and this is where I devote just a few pages to the US context, how the success of envoys abroad has provoked rich dialogue in the United States about what a domestic coordinator position could look like. And if you'd like more detail on that, I will refer you to Holly, because she gave me fantastic insight into that. I'll conclude with this. There's a lot to consider still. This is a starting point, hopefully, for more rich envoy research. Envoys are doing important work. They're not merely symbolic symbols like maybe most would presume they are. And while envoys are important, it's too soon to tell their total impact. There's no agreed upon indicators or benchmarks to determine the downstream impacts of their efforts. And also, envoys are not the only people in this fight. There are so many others in government and civil society that are informed individuals leading the charge in this combat anti-Semitism movement, and to essentialize the envoy would be wrong. And I would also say that envoys are not necessarily essential for meaningful government response in anti-Semitism. I'm very grateful to be able to present my research, and would love to discuss more after the fact. But yeah, thank you very much.